Hey, good morning, y'all. Meteorologist John Hominick here with Empire Weather. Latest energy weather forecast update here on Wednesday, March 8th. Looking at the pattern over the next couple days, we're seeing our cold air that we've been talking about for seemingly weeks finally coming into the forecast here, heading down into parts of the Pacific Northwest and then the Great Lakes and Northeast as well this weekend and into the early part of next week. We see that storm-modulated cold really come in here from Monday into Tuesday of next week, with that ridging finally getting beaten down in the southern plains. And so our temperatures really fall several degrees below normal, at least temporarily during that time, with a spike in demand from about the 14th to the 15th, especially as this cold settles in here to the eastern U.S., with temperatures several degrees below normal at that time. But you'll notice that we still have at least a bit of ridging, keeping temperatures slightly above normal for periods of time in the south central plains. Backing up and looking at the pattern across North America, the main feature continues to be the sort of gradual decay of this high latitude block over Canada and the handoff back here to the Pacific. And you see that happening here as we move through the next several days. This blocking really lingers for quite some period of time. And that's a key part of the forecast here moving forward, because it's going to keep the cold around at least as we head into the middle part of March. And if we back this up even further and look at the northern hemisphere, we see an expansive ridge up near the Aleutian Islands, and then this ridging over Greenland as well. So it's not necessarily a huge pattern that's going to support monster cold across the country similar to December, but it is the kind of pattern that will keep some low-level cold air flowing into the country as a result of this equatorward push of these high-latitude blocking continuing. So looking at what the models show, accordingly, we watch these temperature forecasts moving forward, and you see that, there's not this huge cold shock coming down to the plains, and occasionally we'll have this ridging building in. But as we move past mid-March and we watch sort of this evolution, we see the models just bringing in some consistent cold. And this period from the 15th to the 20th of March may very well be the period where we see the most substantial cold across the country as our high latitude blocking continues during that time frame. And so that brings us to the last couple days of March, right? Let's assume that this cooler air lingers into the last week of March or so, past the 20th, towards about the 23rd. And if we look at the pattern across the hemisphere, we have blocking that's sort of gradually weakening here, troughing that's sliding this way, which is actually starting to signal a change in the NAO forecast, which had been such a big negative NAO. Now we're seeing the possibility of a positive NAO developing. And we're also watching this very gradual retrograde of this ridging, right? This ridge started out here over Alaska, and I can back it up and show it to you guys. When it first forms, it starts out right here over Alaska and towards parts of the Aleutians. But as it backs up in the days beyond that, there's a little bit of momentum that moves it back into this region, and then it eventually ends up sliding backwards. You start to retrograde back here past the Aleutians, past Alaska. This isn't a great ridge positioning for cold in the U.S., and as this blocking starts to erode and this ridge retrogrades a bit more, what we're expecting is the reintroduction of the Pacific Jet at some point. That's very, very likely to happen. We also have forecast this even against what some forecast models have suggested. The idea here is that as this retrogrades back, we will see this Pacific Jet really begin to ramp up in the next several days beyond about March 20th. The other thing we look at frequently when it comes to this is what's happening with the MJO, what's happening with the AAM. And as it stands right now, we have a very impressive large positive AAM event that we've seen here. And this is, when we talk about high latitude blocking and the Pacific Jet sort of backing off a bit, this is what we've seen here over the last several days as we moved into the early part of March. But as we move into mid-March, the atmospheric angular momentum starts to fall significantly, and that almost always signals the beginning of the enhancement of the Pacific Jet in the Pacific Ocean, in the Western Pacific, coming out here into the Central Pacific by the time we get into the late March and early April timeframe. And the other thing we know is we have a substantial MJO event ongoing right now. And those MJO events, when they wrap around through phases 7 and 8, we'll pull up the chart here. When they wrap around through phases 7 and 8, and we can see that occurring here, right? This is phase 7, phase 8, phase 1. we almost always see an equatorward shift to the Pacific jet, followed by a jet extension. When that MJO moves back here, the amplitude decreases and it moves into phase 1. And so when we go ahead and look at what the models really show, it's pretty much exactly that, right? We have our equatorward Pacific jet here with this ridging here and our ridging in the high latitudes. And then as we get towards the very, very end of the model runs, we start to see the first signs of that Pacific jet emergence, but it's still very far out there. I think by and large, the models are not actually picking up on that yet. We're not at that time frame yet. The model's only running to about the 22nd of March. And if we go back and look at what we see here from the AAM, that AAM fall is only just about happening around the 20th of March here. So we're still a couple of days away from seeing that. But if we go back and look at prior years that had a similar event, similar evolution here, we can get some ideas as to how this might occur. In April, a lot of the models, a lot of the analogs, of years that were similar and had that same type of MJO event, had that same type of AAM fall, and an eventual Pacific jet extension with a weakening La Nina, which is what we have right now. Those years, almost all of them, featured a jet extension during the month of April, ridging here in the Gulf of Alaska, and then troughing developing off the west coast. And so that is a pattern that favors things warming up here in the southeast and staying cooler here in the Pacific Northwest with a very active flow into the United States. And here we see from a temperature perspective, if we zoom in on this a little bit, that makes a lot of sense. This is where we'll hang on to our cooler air, but those warmer risks really start to work into the southern plains, into the southeast, into the eastern U.S., and we have our cooler troughing in the southwest and a cooler pattern up in the Pacific Northwest and then down into the northern plains as well. And so this makes a lot of sense, even going back and looking at it aloft at 500 millibars. This makes a lot of sense with your extended Pacific jet, your troughs here that come into the west coast. You are allowing your southeast ridge to build, and you keep an active pattern moving in while the northern plains here stay a bit colder, and this active flow continues here with troughs coming out of the southwestern United States. So this is a fairly high confidence forecast as we move forward. If we look at the latest weeklies and we pull up the height anomalies here, watching kind of how this evolves, lo and behold, as we move into the first and second week of April, on the latest weeklies, we see what? We see a trough in the Gulf of Alaska, a ridge in the Gulf of Alaska, a troughing off the coast of the U.S., and a southeast U.S. Ridging signal here during that time frame. And that is very much in line with what we just saw on our analogs. This is what the pattern will likely look like. This is how your flow will move across the United States during that time. So that'll keep cooler risks up here and introduce that warmth back into the south and southeast states with an active flow, plenty of wind opportunities in the southern plains here, and likely moisture down there as well as we move into April. So for the next couple of days, we aren't expecting any major model moves, thinking the volatility will be held off here a little bit. But as we finally get into the weekend and perhaps even the early part of next week, that's when we're likely going to see this change, this falling atmospheric angular momentum, the changes in the Pacific. That's when Eastern Asia and the Pacific jet will really get that boost. That's when we finally are starting and expecting to see some changes on the models on the back end. We'll start introducing that warmth. It's likely sometime late this week or early next week we'll start to get those warmer roll-ons as we start to get April into the back end of the ensemble forecast. But until then, we have cold air, multiple shots of cold, and a couple days of more impressive cold with heating demand running above normal. And we'll watch this April transition as we move through the next couple of days. Again, it's backed not only by the models, but by the analogs and the waveguide evolution across the hemisphere. So a fairly high confidence forecast as we move into April that we'll see things warm up. That's all we got for today. If you guys have any questions, don't hesitate, give us a shout. And thank you as always for watching. Take care.